All right, so this is the new part two of the New Deal, and we're going to be talking about equity in the New Deal. So we're going to focus on uneven access to programs and benefits overall. Okay, so we mentioned how the New Deal was really revolutionary. FDR and his New Deal programs, it really was revolutionary and really helped the American economy, save the economy essentially. But it was not able to overcome America's entrenched racial order or racism in general. So FDR began the presidency as a Democrat, which was a political party supported by segregationists, so people that were okay with segregation. And so your first detail and example, with control of Congress in the hands of Southern Democrats, FDR knew that he had to get their support to be able to pass any of his New Deal legislation. So he knew that he had to make some kind of deals with the South. And so in pursuit of that, he repeatedly refused to support anti-lynching legislation and ignored many civil rights. So he really wanted to keep these segregationists happy. So he ignored a lot of civil rights issues and really support and refused to support any of the anti-lynching legislation. And so the New Deal really needed to overcome long-established systems of discrimination in order to fully be successful and really truly help out everyone and not just a certain few. And so the new administration did not challenge the prevailing racial order to gain what it could. And so due to that, any support for the Black community was being pushed by FDR's wife, Eleanor. So Eleanor Roosevelt was the true, I guess, person behind all of the civil rights actions that actually happened. She was a lot more radical than her husband, for sure. And so with all the racial economic upheaval, the meaning of the New Deal was at stake. So what the New Deal was supposed to stand for. And so low wages really hurt society more than anything. And so newspapers criticized these low wages and prices that seemed to be dragging the country deeper and deeper into the Depression. So crazy concept, the economy is worse, the worse that people get paid, the less that people get paid. And so businesses, for instance, in Charleston, South Carolina, supported the idea that white workers should enjoy higher wages to help dig the economy out of the Depression, but at the same time, they rejected the same idea for Black workers. So they were refusing to see that equal pay helps out the economy more than anything. And so an even better detail is that the Black women working at the Charleston Bagging and Manufacturing Company, they were working 54 hours a week, making an average of $8. So at the same time, someone doing the same exact job would be making double that if they were white. Okay, so the debate over of which industry should enjoy this rising tide of the New Deal also revealed the racialized or racism and the racism behind capitalism. That was the thinking that intentionally excluded workers of color in the name of economic progress. So that's this racialized system of capitalism. And so the New Deal encouraged Black people, but mostly it ignored them overall. So their second-class status pushed unemployment insurance, minimum wages, Social Security, and farm subsidies out of reach for most of them. So for instance, being considered second-class citizens, they weren't able to get any of the a lot of the benefits of the New Deal. So unemployment insurance, minimum wage, Social Security, all these huge programs that helped out so many white working-class families did not help out Black working-class families. And so FDR, once again, did not want to offend the Southern white politicians because he needed their support to pass his programs. So he was willing to, at the expense of African-American families in the South, he was willing to jeopardize their benefit to help pass the New Deal overall. And so at the same time, he kept the armed forces segregated and still allowed discrimination in hiring as well. So these are two other areas where FDR failed. And Black Americans were not the only people affected negatively by this. We see that after 1934, the number of Mexicans being deported fell dramatically by approximately 50%. So that sounds great. That's wonderful. But this repatriation program that we talked about in the last unit, it still lasted until 1939, so right at the outbreak of World War II. And so this was 6 years after FDR was elected, and it was actually halfway through his second term. And so the wave of labor legislation also, and gaining workers' rights also left out so many people. And so this, like I mentioned, the wave of labor empowerment brought on by the New Deal missed a lot of the most vulnerable workers. So this thing called peonage, Peonage, it was kind of hidden in these rural communities, especially in the South. So peonage is where if you can't pay your debts, you could be put into prison. And so, as we know, with unemployment so high, so many people were going bankrupt and losing everything and then being put into prison. And so, although it was technically illegal, the FDR administration turned a blind eye to it. So they ignored that it was going on. And so it wasn't until World War II that the Justice Department began actively investigating and trying more cases. So it took a war for the Justice Department to actually try to put an end to peonage. And so the move was done out of fear that racial inequalities would have been used as anti-American propaganda by the Nazis or by the Japanese. So it wasn't just out of the good of the Americans' heart, it was in an attempt to, make us look good during the war and keep morale boosted during the war once the war broke out. Okay, so we see, shocker, capitalism and racism are tied together. This racialized capitalism, it produced a political system that supported the employer class, so the bosses, big business. And so the employer class, the elites, they work to keep wages suppressed, squash dissent, and curtail the freedoms of Black and immigrant workers. So the big force behind all of these benefits that helped out the white middle class, the elites used to prevent minorities from gaining those same benefits. It was all as a way to maintain power and money. And so, for instance, the Social Security and National Labor Relations Act, this is important, of 1935, it made and excluded agriculture and domestic workers. So it excluded farmers and domestic workers, which were primarily minorities. So the ability to get Social Security and retire was created during this time, but it was made purposely to leave out minorities. So like I mentioned, it left out Black and Hispanic workers. And all of this was due to compromises that FDR made, once again, he made with the Southern Democrats to get these programs through Congress. So he was worried about getting these through Congress at the expense of minorities. For instance, another example, Black workers in Birmingham organized what was known as the Forgotten Workers of America in 1933. So they were wanting to highlight how they were being left out. And their purpose was simply to democratize FDR's industrial policies. So they wanted to gain all the benefits that FDR was pushing through. Crazy concept, right? And so these politicians built their careers, these big-time politicians built their careers at the expense of Black and brown labor. So yet another example of politicians making money and then by default, big business making money at the expense of Black and brown labor. And so they became leading figures in places like Mississippi, Florida, and believe it or not, California. So that just goes to show that it's not just in the South where racism is strong. It's all across the country. And so they opposed every effort to reform labor and civil rights laws. And we're going to see this doesn't just stop whenever World War II ends. This is going to continue into the 1950s and 1960s with the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement. So the same group of people and politicians, they were also big proponents of the military-industrial complex, which took away countless resources from our nation and was sent to Latin and South America, as well as Asia, to in the form of military spending. So we're going to see so many resources, whether it be people or natural resources, being sent to South America and Asia in the form of military weapons to prevent other areas from rising up and having the people take power. Okay, last section. Agricultural and domestic workers, as we mentioned, were excluded from the New Deal protections. And so these industries were the two largest employers of Black and brown labor. And so they were prevented from enjoying things like Social Security, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which made sure that people had the same rights within the workplace, as well as the National Labor Relations Act, which gave the right to organize and make a union. So jobs and careers that were mainly employers of Black and brown labor did not get these same protections. And so these exclusions only exacerbated Black and Hispanic poverty. And so how we always talk about the big wealth gap, this was a huge reason why there's such a huge wealth gap. And so the reality helped to enshrine racial divisions within labor, which also make it easier for those in power to stay in power. So anytime we've talked about there was gains being made towards evening the playing field, we see different programs or loopholes like this used to prevent that from happening. And so New Deal programs in New Mexico promoted literacy, vocational skills, and Hispanic customs. But Hispanic Americans share their knowledge and skills with each other at these various CCC camps across the state. So where they were building different buildings, working on the conservation efforts with lakes and rivers and roads and all that, we saw that cultural customs were being shared and spread. And so some camps even granted high school diplomas and trade certificates. So there were many positive aspects as well. Improvement efforts closely resembled what was known as assimilation programs. And so, but at the same time, this presented tension between preserving Hispanic culture and creating genuine positive change. So they were put almost like I had to weigh it out. So the romanticization of pre-industrial life got in the way of real success in the face of the 20th century economic, social, and political hurdles. So through New Deal programs, for example, the town of Chupadero was able to end most of its family's reliance on relief by 1933, so positive. But at the same time, this was more of an exception than the norm. So this wasn't happening all across the Hispanic community. It was just certain instances. At the same time, the city of Taos was able to create a successful craft economy appealing to tourists. But at the same time, this type of growth offered limited growth after the fact, as it did not involve any education or trade programs. So like we see, there were positive aspects, but at the same time, it had to be weighed against the negative aspects. And so we saw that another example is that many New Deal programs excluded or even hurt the Black population overall. So for instance, the AAA paid farm owners not to grow certain crops because they were trying to help the ground heal and become nutrient again. And so these landowners, though, were typically white, would fire their sharecroppers, which were typically Black, because of this policy. They wouldn't want to have workers not working. And so there was no need for farm labor when you're not getting paid to not grow, like I mentioned. And so the NRA, the National Relations Administration, they at the same time regulated industries which typically excluded Black workers. And so that we saw that industries that were dominated by workers of color, like domestic work and agriculture, did not benefit from the NRA regulations. So whereas the NRA was regulating and making sure that industries that were predominantly white were benefiting all the workers, where there were industries that were predominantly black or brown labor, we saw we're not getting the same protections for their workers. And so we saw that an example of this kind of disparity in protections, we saw that workers of color were less likely than white workers to enjoy things like minimum wage and maximum hours allowed to work a week. So the maximum hours is set at like 40 hours a week. So we also saw that the Social Security Act largely excluded Black workers. And they were unable to receive the guaranteed government pensions in their older years. And so this increased elderly and family poverty. So overall, what I'm wanting y'all to see is that the New Deal was so revolutionary and amazing that really helped get our country through almost the cliff. We were about to go off the cliff into economic depression. The country was ready to revolt and overthrow the capitalist system. So while it helped save our nation's economy in so many ways, there was always those loopholes that prevented everyone from benefiting, as we mentioned with the Black and brown communities and Black and brown labor that was left out in so many different ways. So just like we've always talked about with looking at presidents, we have to look at the good and the bad to be able to make those decisions on their legacy overall. So if you have any questions, feel free to share, and we'll pick up here next time.